Today, we're going to tear into something really interesting, a critical look at a book called The Brain, Male or Female. A professor's analysis of it is basically a masterclass in how to pick apart scientific claims. So, let's get into it. So, right off the bat, the critique zeroes in on the title itself. The professor argues that framing it like this, male or female, immediately shoves us into this rigid black and white box. It suggests there are only two models of brain with no room for overlap, no complexity, no gray area. And that kind of simplification, well, it's flagged as a huge red flag that maybe, just maybe, the conclusion was written before the research even began.
So let's really dig in here. The professor basically says this binary framing isn't new. It's an ancient way of thinking, just dressed up in a lab coat. It sets the stage for a study that seems designed from the start to find differences, not to genuinely explore the incredible spectrum of human neurology.
All right, let's get to the first big point of the critique. It's all about the book's entire foundation, and specifically, how it totally misunderstands the concept of equality. And honestly, this is where it gets really good. So get this. This is a direct quote from the book, and the professor who critiqued it says this line is, and I'm quoting here, bewildering and alarming. And you can see why, right? It's what's called a straw man argument. It builds up a fake definition of equality just to knock it down. And this really breaks it down perfectly. The book works from this bizarre premise that for men and women to be equal, they have to be biologically identical, like clones. But the professor just slams that idea down, saying, hold on a second, that's not what anyone is arguing. The fight for equality has never been about being the same. It's always been about having the same rights, the same dignity, and the same shot at opportunities, regardless of our differences. So you see the problem, right? The whole argument is built on this faulty foundation. And according to the critique, that means we're not really talking about neutral science anymore. It feels a lot more like an ideology that's just cherry-picking facts to back itself up, instead of the other way around. Okay, moving on to the second major point of the critique. This one's about a big idea, biological determinism versus how things actually work, which is interaction. So what is biological determinism? Well, if you're not familiar, it's basically the idea that biology is destiny. You know, the belief that your genes and your hormones are the puppet masters, pulling all the strings, and things like your environment or upbringing don't really matter all that much. And apparently, the book is a huge fan of this idea. It kind of suggests that science has moved on from caring about things like education or culture, and now it's all about chemicals and hormones. The professor's take on that? It's a massive oversimplification, like a huge one. Because here's the thing, modern science sees it completely differently. It's not one or the other. It's a giant, messy, beautiful interaction. Your biology, your environment, your friends, your school, it's all part of this incredible feedback loop. You just can't pull them apart and say one is all that matters. Which brings us to the so-called evidence the book presents. And according to the critique, a lot of it isn't really science. It's just old stereotypes dressed up to look like facts. For instance, the book asks these leading questions, why do girls like dolls and boys like cars and guns? The professor's response is pretty sharp. That's not science, that's just looking around. It reflects what society gives kids to play with, not necessarily some inescapable biological truth they're born with. And this is such a key difference, isn't it? Real science is hard work. It's about control groups, isolating variables, crunching the numbers. It's a whole rigorous process. It's definitely not just asking questions that are designed to confirm what people already believe. The book also apparently trots out those ancient stereotypes, you know the ones, the rational man and the emotional woman, and it presents them as if they're proven, established scientific facts. The critique calls this out as not just wrong, but extremely dangerous. So you might be thinking, okay, but what's the big deal? Why does this matter? Well, according to this analysis, this isn't just some dusty academic argument. These ideas have very real consequences out in the real world. When you frame these things as biological destiny, it can be used as an excuse. The book apparently does this to justify things like male polygamy. It can also be used to limit our expectations for people. For example, the critique points out how the book pushes back against the idea of involved fatherhood, which just flies in the face of decades of research. It's like this kind of thinking just wants to slam the door shut on any kind of social progress. Okay, let's bring it all home. The professor's summary really cuts to the chase, asking the big question. Are we dealing with science here, or is it just ideology?
And it boils down to four main weaknesses. One, it gets equality and similarity completely mixed up. Two, it passes off stereotypes as actual evidence. Three, it's stuck on this rigid biological determinism, ignoring everything else. And four, its language is so polarizing it just, as the professor puts it, freezes the debate before it can even start.
And then there's this one last thing. The critique points out some really weird, out-of-left-field claims in the book. Like, there's a reference to a rise in female crime that seems to have nothing to do with anything. The professor calls it surprising and suspect, which, yeah, it just makes you wonder what the real agenda of the book is. So, after all this, we're left with a really important question for ourselves. When we hear these kinds of arguments about biology and behavior, how do we get good at telling the difference? How do we know when we're looking at real, neutral science versus an argument that's just pushing an agenda? That's definitely something worth thinking about.